This is my second episode in my series over the brief history of the United States, and this time we're talking about the American Revolution from 1765 to 1783. This first part is the growth of the Revolution itself. Following the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763 in my previous video, the 13 colonies expected many rewards for their help in the war, especially via territories in the West that was now taken from the old French colonial empire. However, the British government completely refused this. Not only did they transfer all the Western territories to governance of Montreal, which prevented the colonies from expanding, they also began taxing the colonies instead to make up for war debts, which ended this policy of salutary neglect. This includes various taxes such as the Molasses Act, Stamp Act, and the Sugar Act, which I will not go into depth here, but I'll likely make videos over at some point, which only rose tensions as a whole. With Britain refusing the compromise, especially with the Declaratory Act of 1763, which is essentially the British king saying that they were king, the colonies were colonies, and that they should be following whatever the crown wants, which angered the colonists even further. The 1770 Boston Massacre was a great shift here. They did force some British concessions after the murder of these colonists, yet they continued minor taxation on tea, which is very important here because this shows that the British refused to acknowledge the actual gripe with the recent change. It wasn't necessarily the fact that the taxation was a large amount. In fact, I've seen multiple reports that say the taxation wasn't really significant at all for most people at the time period. However, they were just simply against the idea of taxation in the first place without proper representation. So even though they reduced a lot of the taxation, keeping even just a singular piece of taxation on tea highlighted that the British government still wanted to force their hand in the colonies. The Tea Act then led to the 1773 Boston Tea Party. In retaliation, the British enacted the Intolerable Acts, which essentially stripped all liberties away from the Massachusetts colony, which angered the colonies even further, and the First Continental Congress convened in 1774, which boycotted all British goods, cutting imports by around up to 90%, I believe, as well as preparing the Minutemen for the eventual conflict. The next part here is the Revolutionary War itself. The first real battles of the Revolutionary War began with Lexington and Concord on April 19, 1775, which were a British attempt to seize the Concord Arsenal in Massachusetts. Despite winning initially after leaving Boston in Lexington against the Minutemen militia that fought them, whenever they moved over to Concord to try to seize the armory, they would actually lose against the higher number of Minutemen militia that gathered there, and after they started retreating back to Boston, they were fighting constant skirmishes, which reduced their numbers greatly, and they had to retreat all the way to Boston and pretty much hold out for reinforcements. At this time, Thomas Paine's Common Sense was published soon after on January 10, 1776, which bolstered support for independence. The Second Continental Congress also started convening from 1775 to 1781. It was multiple different meetings, but it was essentially the same policy where it was during wartime on how to go through the war, their major actions, and so forth. This was held by all 13 colonies, and over this time period, the two major things they did was they created the Continental Army itself, which was a formal army instead of the Minutemen as before, and also the Declaration of Independence in 1776. Boston was eventually taken back from the British after a siege, and these next battles I mentioned here are essentially oversimplified or just major battles I want to mention that shifted the tide of the war in some major way. The Battle of Trenton was important because it was the first battle. It was the battle immediately after the famous crossing of the Delaware by George Washington, as well as it essentially crushed the Hessians, which were German mercenaries hired by the British to fight in the war. After defeating them decisively in this battle, they became much weaker and also showed the Americans could hold their own even against the most advanced troops. Saratoga would convince France to help the revolutionaries in the war, turning it into a European war as well and not just in America. And Yorktown in 1781 ended most British strength in America, crushing most of their campaign. Finally, in 1783, this new Treaty of Paris, again the dates are very important for these as there's multiple Treaty of Parises in US history, was signed, which eventually ended the war with an American victory and their formal independence, gaining essentially all modern American land up to these areas, with some disputed territories around some certain regions. The most important part is clearly the Americans had won this war and were now independent from the British crown and can now establish their own new country.